From the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., this is Rendezvous with History, a podcast that captures the drama of presidential decision-making. Dr. Anthony Eames sits down with prominent scholars and leading citizens to bring to life what happens in the White House and how it shapes the world.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Welcome back, Rendezvous with History listeners. I'm joined here today with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library and non-resident Senior Fellow at the Miller Center, and for our purposes here today, the author of the sure-to-be-soon bestseller, if not already bestseller, Making the Presidency John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. Lindsay, so great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
So, the Adams family seemed to be getting its due lately. We just had Dr. Randall Woods on for his new biography on John Quincy Adams. And you're covering the father, of course. Tell me a little bit, you're the executive director of the George Washington Library, not the John Adams Libraries. Why a book on John Adams?
Well, I think John Adams, despite maybe getting his due, is still not as appreciated or understood as some of his contemporaries. He's sandwiched between Washington and Jefferson as president, and that's never really a fun place to be. So he definitely has fewer books than they do, and this is hopefully adding one more to the pile. But I think most importantly for me, his presidency is really underappreciated because so many of the biographies had to decide what to leave out. And whenever you're writing about a book whenever you're writing about a life that is as full as John Adams' life was, you have to make cuts, you have to make decisions. And a lot of people chose to give relatively few pages to the presidency. And I think that I can understand until perhaps more recent events have shown a new light on Adams, have demonstrated that his contributions to the survival of our democratic institutions, and most importantly, being the peaceful transfer of power, demonstrate that I think he really does need additional applause and history and writing about those contributions.
So let's get into this. You kind of mentioned that Adams has gotten kind of shortchanged his presidency within his own life, but then really among the framers of the Constitution, the kind of early leaders of the American Republic, I guess he might be the only one who has an HBO special or HBO series, but other than that, he's gotten shortchanged. You say something in your introduction that really struck me, and I hadn't thought about it this way. George Washington created the presidency, but Adams defined it. Right, that's one. And then two, he's guaranteed to fall short in comparison to Washington. I mean, why is he guaranteed to fall short, and how does he define the presidency?
Well, so much of what I'm about to say next sounds like it is hyperbole and the type of description that we are typically quite uncomfortable using to describe politicians, past or present. But Washington was a completely unparalleled person in American history. He had such unusual stature and such widespread respect. There has never been anyone like him that has had that reputation. There will never be anyone like him again. And he was already being referred to as the father of the country before he became the first president, just for context. So even when he left the presidency, although he had started to receive additional criticism and some people had started to sort of criticize some of his choices, he was still this very beloved, very revered figure. And so whoever came next was going to fall short. Whoever came next was going to fail in comparison. And I think one of Adams's contributions is that he knew that, and he did it anyway, understanding that if, Washington created this thing, if he created the presidency, it would mean nothing if someone didn't then step in to prove that someone else could do it and continue a lot of those precedents that are still so central to the presidency today. So when I say that he defined the presidency, what I mean is that he made the institution work for everyone after Washington, for everyone else who was going to be of mere mortal status and was going to have much more partisan divide and much more criticism and much more pushback when they tried to use presidential authority. And he made that work.
Well, let's jump right into some of those most critical moments that challenged the Adams presidency. And a lot of it has to do with France. that pesky XYZ affair that really kind of sets the table for how Americans think about a standing military, standing army, how Americans consider free speech in times of political discord. But first, can you lay out for me the XYZ affair, Adams' role in it, Adams' role in kind of overseeing it or managing it, and where that leads us in the U.S.?
Well, a little bit of background context first. So at the end of Washington's presidency, he had signed the Jay Treaty with Great Britain, and France really hated that treaty because they felt like it undermined their special status as the United States' premier ally. And in response, they started seizing American ships and imprisoning American sailors and selling off the goods that were on those ships, which was obviously very unpopular behavior in the United States. So one of the first things that Adams did as president was decide to send a 3-person peace commission to France to try and sign a new treaty that would resolve some of these lingering issues and reestablish the relationship between France and the United States on firm footing. That 3-person commission was made up of Elbridge Gerry, John Marshall, and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. So it represented all the different parts of the Union. Some were more extreme Federalists, some were sort of apolitical, and it was, I think, intended as a really good commission. So the 3-person commission went to France. Upon their arrival, they were immediately met with a bombardment of demands for loans, really inappropriate loans, bribes, and then really embarrassing apologies before diplomacy could even begin. So these were sort of precursor requisites to even getting official recognition as diplomats there on behalf of the United States. And that was really offensive behavior to the envoys. They spent the next several months kind of trying to get around it, trying to figure out how to begin the official negotiations. And finally, they were basically kicked out of France when they would not comply with those demands. When word of that treatment got back to the United States, it became known as the XYZ affair because the individuals that had been making these demands were described in the envoy's dispatches as Agent X, Agent Y, and Agent Z. There was actually also an Agent W, but I guess that doesn't really roll off the tongue in the same way. So the XYZ, the dispatches caused this enormous uproar, and the XYZ affair became a really central turning point in Adams' presidency because foreign policy was always going to be the president's primary responsibility, but this made it seem as though war with France was perhaps just over the horizon. And Congress responded with a number of important measures. It created a naval department for the first time and expanded the Navy, which Adams was thrilled about because he had been asking for that for years. It greatly expanded the Army, which he was less thrilled about. It improved coastal defenses. And then it also passed a series of bills that were, on their surface, designed to target fears of political violence, but were really using the fears of the moment to target political opponents, and in particular, the immigrant voting base that tended to support the Jeffersonian Republicans. And that was all in the summer of 1798.
But this isn't, we talk about the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Federalists. It's a story of political partisanship that many Americans are aware of, the kind of founding, era of polarization and party discord in our country. And yet, a central theme in your book, and a theme that you draw out that many others kind of leave as a lesser narrative, is the role of the arch Federalists, and that tug of war that Adams has within his own party that's really kind of constraining his room for operation, his room for action, the way he can interact with the Republicans. Tell me a little bit about these arch Federalists and why they're such a pain in Adams' side.
Yeah, so the Federalists had basically been in power since the beginning of Washington's presidency, which was in 1789. And this is, I think, true over many generations of American political cycles, but it's a little bit easier to maintain unanimity within a party when you're in the opposition. It's a little bit harder when you're in office. And Adams felt the full force of those divisions coming to the fore. And that was because the Arch Federalists, which were the more extreme wing of the Federalist Party, really wanted war with France. They didn't just want the army or the navy, they wanted to actually use it. And that was because they felt like war would be beneficial to their political prospects. They were using the army as basically a spoils system to build out party support. And some of the more extreme members, including Alexander Hamilton, had ideas about marching the army south to intimidate political rivals and opponents and to seize land from Spain and France. Adams looked at all of those goals and thought a lot of them were absolutely nuts, if not unconstitutional. And so while he applauded the creation of the Navy and he thought that having a stronger base of defense was going to make it diplomacy beneficial, he never really thought war was all that likely or all that positive of a thing to pursue, because you just can never predict what's going to happen, especially when you're fighting against Napoleon. You just don't know. And so he was really committed to trying to pursue diplomacy through strength, and the Navy made that possible. He certainly did not want to use the army in a domestic in a domestic situation, because he understood how many Americans were very distrusting of standing armies and already had fears, if not memories, of that exact same thing during the Revolution.
Lindsay, you came very close to uttering a favorite Reagan Institute tagline of peace through strength, but Adams and the diplomacy
missed
strength.
Opportunity.
We missed the opportunity.
Oh, missed opportunity.
On future podcasts, I assume that you'll start using John Adams as the father of peace through strength in the early republic.
Naturally.
But, you have an episode in this book. Adams had been essentially an estranged vice president, really sets the tone as the VP who does nothing under Washington. And it's at the very end of Washington's presidency. Adams going into office. He summons him up to the head of the table, right? And it's there where you reveal that Adams is thrilled that it seems that all of his foreign policies and ideas about, how to marshal the strength of the republic, the men-at-arms, in the United States are in line with Washington. And yet there's a kind of an interesting dance that he has to manage as he takes power as the commander-in-chief and still needs Washington. Tell us more about the Washington-Adams relationship. I mean, one that it seems very difficult, and yet at times there's moments of sincere, perhaps intellectual affection. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, I think any president has always struggled with how to manage their post-presidential life. That is a challenge because once you leave that office, unless you're John Quincy Adams, you're probably not going to have a career afterwards. And so every president in their post-presidential life, I think, has struggled with how involved to be, how open to be, how overtly political to be. And that is just this scratching the surface of the beginning of the challenges for Washington and Adams. They certainly had respect for one another. They both respected each other's long public service career and expertise and experience. Dispositionally, they were incredibly different, so I don't think they ever really clicked. Although in terms of their policy, in terms of what they thought, how they thought about domestic policy, how they thought about foreign policy, how they thought about diplomacy and the rule of law, they were actually kind of in lockstep. And if they had actually talked more, I think they would have been delighted that they had so much common ground. Adams's challenge was when it was clear that France was potentially going to declare war, although he didn't ever think that was that likely, and Congress had created this expanded army. He had two challenges. The first was that his allies, the arch-federalist allies in Congress and in the cabinet, wanted to make Alexander Hamilton the commander-in-chief. And John Adams wanted anyone else other than Alexander Hamilton. He did not trust him. He did not trust him with that political authority.
Why not?
And the best way... Well, because Hamilton was nuts. He was brilliant, but he just had really significantly different ideas about how to use power. He was the chief architect of the idea of taking the army south through the United States to crush the Republicans, to seize land, which would have started more wars. He also usually thought he was the smartest person in the room. He deferred to Washington, but that deference did not really extend to anyone else. And he didn't like Adams because Adams could not be controlled. Adams was what we would think of as he called him too independent, which is kind of an insane thing to say about a president. We want them to be independently minded. So Adams didn't trust Hamilton. Hamilton didn't trust Adams. And the best way for Adams to thwart Hamilton's ambitions was to put Washington at the top, because no one could argue with that. He also did have a second motivation for doing so, which is that if you are going to have a war, if there is going to be a crisis, then no one is going to be more unifying than Washington. And so I think he had good reason for wanting to bring Washington into this project. The problem was that the cabinet, both the Arch-Federalists in the cabinet and then the Arch-Federalists out of the cabinet, maneuvered and schemed and connived to basically force Washington to box Adams into a corner, to appoint Alexander Hamilton as the number 2 in the army. And because Washington was going to stay home at Mount Vernon until the French army invaded, the number 2 was going to have a lot of power. And I blame Washington for allowing himself to be put into this situation. And I understand that once Adams was faced with it, he had no choice but to back down, because he could not have Washington resigning from his command. It would completely destroy his presidency. But it was a very difficult moment in their relationship, and one that I don't think John Adams ever really forgave.
Let's talk about some other difficult relationships. There's the famous one, Jefferson and Adams. And you actually point to some moments where that relationship wasn't always destined to go south. Mm-hmm. What are the highlights? Where were the moments of opportunity? And then how did it go south?
Well, at the start of Adams' presidency, Adams and Jefferson were not super close, but they were still on decent terms, despite the fact that they had just competed against one another in the presidential election. And that was because they had both played almost no role in that election. Their supporters had done the campaigning. They hadn't been involved. It wasn't as nasty as the election 4 years later. And so Adams had real hope that this would be a bipartisan administration and could function as such. He had real hope that they could actually work together. He had great respect for Jefferson's intellect. Certainly Jefferson was very experienced when it came to diplomacy, and he felt like, given that there was a conflict with France and Jefferson had a reputation of being friendly to France, then that might actually be an asset to their diplomatic exchanges. And initially, I think Jefferson was okay with this idea too. He demonstrated his attempts to conduct outreach to Adams. He was interested in trying to be supportive. When it wasn't initially the results of the election, they took a long time to come in, and he said if there was a tie, then Adams should be president because he was his superior in all of their previous positions. But very quickly, Jefferson turned away from Adams and began to think the worst of Adams without ever talking to him about what he was thinking. I think partly that's because James Madison, was sort of pushing that, and partly it was because Jefferson was much more actually of a party man than Adams was. Jefferson was a ideological Jeffersonian Republican, whereas Adams was not an ideological Federalist. And that caused Jefferson to really retreat to the Republican line as opposed to maintaining this bipartisan coalition.
There's some interesting background players in this story of Adams' presidency. And it's a background player that many Americans are familiar with today, and that's disease, and that's pandemic and plague, right? Philadelphia turns into a ghost town, as you point out, every summer. I mean, down to, I think one number you cited, 7,000 people, which is, small town America today. How does disease shape the Adams presidency? How does disease shape all these political issues that Adams grappling, from the size of the army to new departments to the inter-party conflict? I mean, on and on and on. You kind of just do a nice job of reminding us throughout the book that it's still there and it's still something to contend with and still something to deal with.
Well, disease was an ever-present factor of life for them because they did not have modern medicine, and it was incredibly unpredictable. So you never really knew when things were going to crop up, and when people did get sick, they could be sick and really out of commission for a really long time. What's fascinating about the 1790s is it was the sort of high point of yellow fever outbreaks in the United States, in particular in Philadelphia, New York, and other urban centers where mosquitoes really ran rampant through the terrible water in the ports and in like the standing pools of disgustingness before running water and sewage. And the pandemics are really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, they were viewed very politically. So the Federalists thought that they were caused by one thing, and the Republicans thought that they were viewed by another or caused by another. And they had different treatments, and they had different doctors that they saw depending on their political persuasion. But it also affected how the government worked every single summer because at the first hint of yellow fever, most of the department secretaries and their families and their offices would decamp to a local town. Trenton, New Jersey was a favorite. And so what that meant was you had this period of disruption. Typically, Washington and then Adams were actually home in those periods. They either would go to Mount Vernon or to Quincy, but it changed the dynamic because you were away from the main hub, the seat of government. You were away from Congress. You were away from the courts. So if there were court cases, they couldn't be called in as witnesses or bring forth materials themselves. And it was a regular cyclical event in political life in the early 1790s. And so it really is fascinating to see their letters saying, when can we start the session of Congress? And it depends on when the frost was and when the mosquitoes were killed off. They didn't know it was because of the mosquitoes. They understood that frost had something to do with it, but they didn't totally know why. But it definitely did shape how they operated on a day-to-day way.
Yeah, one wonders how John Adams and Thomas Jefferson would get along via Zoom or maybe on social media, just how they would navigate such a roll call digital age voting era in Congress or, in our political discourse. So there's this question about a lot of the early Republic figures that I think is starting to be revisited by a number of scholars, by a number of kind of public intellectuals, popular media. And the question is, what are we missing? And for so long, we thought we knew, as a general public, the story of George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, what have you. But what are we missing about John Adams? What are you adding here?
Well, I think there's like the actual technicalities of how we tell the story, and the benefit of writing in this period of time is that the Adams editorial project is in full swing, making their papers much more accessible and much more complete. And so it's actually we're actually able to tell a story in a way that has not necessarily been told before. But what I want people to take from the story is that the John Adams that they think that they know, the John Adams that has been handed down over centuries, is really a creation of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. They were opponents of Adams, especially in 1800, for different reasons, and they were writing about him at a time when they were competing politically. And their writings are, therefore, completely partisan. And what's interesting is typically when historians are relying on sources from Hamilton and Jefferson, they take them with a grain of salt, because they are often quite partisan actors, or they're biased actors. Everyone is biased, but they sometimes could be particularly focused in their agenda. And yet when it comes to their description of Adams, people over the decades and the centuries have accepted those descriptions as fact or taken them verbatim. And I don't think that that's accurate. To be sure, he sometimes had a hot head. To be sure, he could be stubborn and was a little bit of a curmudgeon. But he also was far more politically savvy than they gave him credit for. He was far more funny and loving and joyful. He had a real sense of humor, especially about himself. He was incredibly self-deprecating. And so he was much more of a complete person. He was much more of a complete politician than we think he was. And as a result, I think he's actually among the most accessible of the founders because he does present such a full picture that is really useful for us today.
Well, tell me this. I mean, you say he's a politically savvy politician. he's kind of funny. His rotundity, I guess, is one of his great nicknames. You paint this almost Adams as a charmer, if you will. Why doesn't he control his own historical narrative? Why is it Jefferson and Hamilton who've been able to tell us what we should think about Adams for centuries now?
I think there are a couple of reasons. So one of them is how the political parties have evolved. So Hamilton really became associated with the Federalist Party because he was associated with the really arch Federalist wing, and that was the wing that survived the longest, particularly up in New England. And so they were dominating the Federalist narrative. And so without a party to sort of promote and maintain and keep the memory alive of Adams' legacy, he did fall by the wayside. And we see the difference of that when we look at Jefferson, because Jefferson was associated with the Jeffersonian Republican Party. His successors then went on to maintain power. So James Madison and James Monroe, they were diehard Jefferson loyalists, and they repeated his lines and his agenda, hook, line, and sinker, while they were president and afterwards. And so it's the combination, I think, of, it says that people say that history is written by the winners. So Jefferson is the winner, Jefferson writes the history, and then the other party is really dominated by Hamilton. So I think that's largely the main reason that we don't really remember him. The other big reason is that most of the biographies of Adams, all of the biographies of Adams, were written before January 6th. And most Americans in the 20th century took the peaceful transfer of power for granted. And so they were not, and I don't criticize that because I did too. But as a result, they were not looking for the things that Adams did to make those first two transitions possible. And I think that history depends on the questions we ask. What history we write, it depends what we're looking for. And I was looking for those things because I had lived through that contested transition, and I wanted to know where that practice started.
Lindsay, let's dive into that. You were looking for the issue of transition of power, right? What made those transitions, both from Washington to Adams, which, outgoing president retiring, perhaps a little more taken for granted, but really Adams to Jefferson, so successful. I mean, what are the concrete steps and things and that Adams actually did to make that a precedent that we all came to take for granted as Americans?
So I think the number one thing to know is that none of the character of the transition or the character of the transition, or the character of the transition or the character of the transfer of power is written down in the Constitution. It doesn't say anything. And a lot of the statutes that we rely on today that trigger the intelligence briefings or the office space for transition teams, none of that existed either. So all of this had to be done from scratch. And in 1787, they were doing it for the first time in a way that at a time when we tend to overlook that transition because we know what has come later and we see them as the same party, but they didn't see it that way. They saw it as this momentous occasion for the first time in human history, which was a little bit of an exaggeration, but their words, that one person peacefully handed over power to another. And they were so thoughtful about every detail, including where people sat in Congress Hall, how people exited from the room. So Washington was present. He was quite intentional about making sure that his presence was a bulwark against any sort of threat and to give his symbolic approval to the new administration. But on the way out, he walked out of the room after Adams. And it was probably the first time in maybe 2 decades, if not more, that Washington walked out of the room behind someone. So that in of itself is a hugely symbolic gesture. Adams planned his outfit knowing that so that it wouldn't clash with Washington and it would be different than Jefferson, but appropriately somber. So, every single detail was quite carefully cultivated. And people writing about that day said that tears were streaming down the faces of the people in the building and that it was the most sublime thing in history. So again, maybe we would call that exaggeration, but they did not think so. 4 years later, it was even more tense because this was transitioning of power from one party to another. And the election of 1800 had come very close to a violent overthrow of the Constitution. That is not hyperbole. There were militias stationed on the border of Virginia and Pennsylvania. There was a mob outside the Capitol threatening to kill anyone who interfered or placed a different president on top of the administration. And Adams looked at the Constitution and he looked to see what the president's role was and realized there was no role in deciding the outcome of this election. And so he practiced restraint, which is not a characteristic we typically celebrate as Americans. It's a lot harder to define. It's a lot harder to put on a monument than, winning a war, but it is sometimes in moments of crisis quite essential. So he did not interfere in the process in the House where they were counting votes and trying to figure out who was going to break this tie. And then once it was clear that Jefferson was going to be the winner, he had Jefferson over to the White House. He and Jefferson met with Abigail so that Jefferson could meet some of the staff and figure out who he might want to hire. He wrote Jefferson a note about what was in the stables so he didn't have to buy new horses. He instructed his cabinet members to give Jefferson updates about what was happening in their departments. So, what we would think of as like briefings before that was mandated. And then he went home. He lost and he went home. And that was a radical revolutionary thing to do. And when he got home, he wrote a letter to Jefferson saying that it was peaceful and he wished him success and happy administration. And that set the tone for what transitions should be and set a remarkable model for his successors to follow.
What an interesting idea. The idea that going home can be radical and revolutionary. You've pointed out that both these transition moments were essentially celebrated. Certainly the first one celebrated more in public, perhaps, but the second one revered for kind of the sensibilities that Adams could take to that very important moment. Looking back at some of your other comments, circling back to some of your other comments about history written by the winners. Hamilton carried the Federalist Party. Jefferson, really the ideological Republican. There's someone who's kind of very absent in our conversation so far, and that's John Quincy, right? Who is able to kind of become a master orator, becomes the president himself. Really, in some ways, the Adams family could lay claim to the first presidential dynasty of the United States. Not in some ways, very much can. Why didn't John Quincy more effectively carry the flag for John Adams' presidency?
Well, I think both John and John Quincy, they really did not see themselves as party men. They saw themselves as Americans, and they believed that their public service, especially as president, was supposed to be above party politics, and they were supposed to represent all Americans. So in some ways, I think he would have thought it beneath him. He did at times later write about his father's legacy, but he tended to focus more on the revolution because it was a little bit easier to celebrate. He celebrated July 4th quite avidly every year, although once his father died, it became a little bit more of a bittersweet holiday. But I think that his service, their entire family service, they saw the revolution as a family project. The Republic was a family project that they were committed to. And that was what he was keen on defending. It wasn't necessarily his father's presidency, but rather the role in preserving these institutions. And he did write extraordinarily beautiful letters about his father's contributions to upholding the things that really characterized the Republic. The last thing that I think I would say is that they both had faith that history would see their contributions and would judge them accordingly, which is one of the reasons they were so meticulous about saving their papers. They were sometimes kind of hoarders, and I'm very grateful for it because it's really helpful to have all those materials. But they did believe that history would be able to assess them correctly. And I hope that I'm doing a little bit of service in that direction because I think that they do both actually deserve a lot more praise for their contributions.
So on balance, you judge Adams' presidency to be a success. He left the office more in better shape, stronger than it had been. Any other kind of final takeaways we should carry with us when thinking about the Adams presidency?
Well, one of the key lessons about the election of 1800 that came to the front as I was thinking through it is that at the biggest moment of crisis, when the House was deadlocked between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, and they were in their 30-somethingth ballot, the threat of violence was percolating, and they weren't really sure what to do. The thing that got the nation out of that constitutional crisis, in some ways the military crisis is easier because you have a very clear enemy. When it's a constitutional crisis, it's much harder to figure out. And the thing that got the country through it was not military bravery. It was not acts of incredible genius. It was a couple of congressmen and some others, many of whom were in their 30s and 40s, putting the Constitution and the survival of it above their own partisan interests. And I define that as civic virtue. And that is a lesson that I think is important because in moments of crisis, whenever we've had them in the nation, it's almost always civic virtue of someone saying the country is more important than my political goals, and it's a bipartisan act. That is actually what gets the nation through those moments. And so this is one of those. I would say it's the first constitutional crisis, and I hope provides an excellent model for us as we head into another election season.
Yes, let's keep that all in our minds as we vote in the coming months and move into the next presidential administration, whichever one it may be. What we like to do here at Rendezvous with History is our little send-off, hints for history. What exhibit, what archive, what topic could be further explored by other scholars who want to bring history to life for us?
Gosh, there are so many. I mean, what I would say in terms of like an archive, there are so many incredible collections in archives that are not digitized, and so they often do not get the attention they deserve. So for example, for this book, the Theodore Sedgwick papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society were one of the best sources. They're not digitized, so not too many people have used them, but they have amazing stuff in them. So as a general rule, I would say, look to see what's not digitized. It's probably not been used. It's going to have some new things. But in terms of a general subject, I mean, I'm a scholar of the presidency. I believe very strongly in studying it. But what I really like is understanding how individuals' personalities affect moments of change and crisis. And so I always encourage people to look for some of those lesser understood moments because I think they really matter.
Well, Lindsay, thanks so much for joining us on the pod today. And once again, go out, buy as many copies as you can. Father's Day, Mother's Day, Christmas, birthdays, Making the Presidency John Adams, and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. Thanks so much, Lindsay.
Thank you so much for having me.
Rendezvous with History is a podcast produced by the Ronald Reagan Institute's scholarly initiatives. You can learn more at ronaldreaganinstitute.org and follow along on social media at Reagan Institute.